I always have the pleasure of introducing the speakers for our lectures of new Conservators. I'm from Western Massachusetts, born and raised in Pittsfield in Berkshire County. And I'm amazed when I talk to people who live locally here in Eastern Massachusetts, how many think that the state stops at Worcester. There's a lot of territory in this state west of Worcester, much of it very beautiful and interesting and worthwhile visiting. I go out there during the winter. Just a couple of weeks ago, visited Royalston in search of birds. I'm a bird enthusiast, and there are a number of eruptive winter species that come down from Canada in the winter, and you have to go out there to see them. They're much less frequently seen here. So a visit to Royalston, in addition to making it possible to enjoy the beautiful areas out there, even in the winter, makes it possible to see species of birds that you don't see locally. You know the history of Quabbin Reservoir. 3 small villages or towns were removed in order to make the reservoir possible, to provide the wonderful fresh water we have here in Boston. But there's this interesting area north of Quabbin. And it is interesting that Alan Young moved there in 1973, and as an author and writer, he got interested in the history of that area and has written books that you will see in the back that describe the kind of life that people have out there, who lives out there and what they do in that area. It's unique in many ways, and he'll tell us about that, but he'll also focus on the issue of land protection. Now, it's obvious that you need to protect a watershed around a reservoir, but there are also reasons for protecting land throughout the state, and he's going to talk about the particular issue of land protection, and specifically land protection there in the North Quabbin area. Alan?
Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and congratulations to all of you that have made the Newton Conservancy a successful organization for nearly half a century. That's a great accomplishment. And this state has a very good record of working in the conservation field, going back to the founding of the Trustees of Reservations over 100 years ago, which was the first land trust in the world, really. In fact, it was the model for the British National Trust rather than the other way around. I'm really sort of breaking this talk up into kind of 3 separate sections. I'm going to show some slides, but it's not a slideshow for the whole time. There's probably about 35 slides, and we're going to go through them fairly quickly to give you some images of the region that I have called home since 1973, the region we call the North Quabbin Region. Of course, it didn't get that name until fairly recently because the Quabbin Reservoir wasn't created until the 1930s, and it was created to serve the needs of Boston and surrounding communities. More than 40 communities, including Newton, get their water from the Quabbin. And it's a beautiful reservoir, and it involved the damming up of a river. It was a swift river, and it has 3 branches, and you'll see some pictures of it. So I think after we show the slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Quabbin, and then focus more on the North Quabbin region with a few additional comments about land protection, and specifically about the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, which is an organization that I've been involved with. It was founded 22 years ago. It was named for a hill in the town of Warwick, Mount Grace, which is the highest peak in our region. It's at 1,625 feet. The land trust actually covers a 23-town area, which is about 10% of the Commonwealth. So it's a fairly significant, what we call regional land trust. This is the cover of my book, which is a regional guidebook. It's an unusual book because it's not a guidebook like most guidebooks, in that it covers more than just places to see and things to do. A lot of it is about the local history and the sociology and the economy of the area, because my interest as a journalist is it's pretty broad across many areas, and so it's not really a book just for visitors. It's a book for residents as well as visitors. And this is actually a second version of this first book I wrote. It was called North Quabbin. It was self-published in 1983, and this book just came out a couple of years ago, which is pretty major update with a lot of pictures. There's about 200 pictures. And the image on the cover, the cover's in color. I can't figure out why this is black and white. But the cover shows one of our many local lakes. This one is called Tully Pond, and that's Tully Mountain in the background. Tully Mountain is one of many pieces of protected land in our area. When I moved there in 1973, it was not protected, and now it is. It's part of a state wildlife management area. This is a picture of the Quabbin Reservoir with one of the many water birds that you can, waterfowl that you can see there. You can go boating on the Quabbin. You need a fishing license. The fishing lobby was very successful in allowing small motorboats as well as shore fishing in certain areas of the Quabbin. The engineers and the specialists have claimed that there's no harm to the water done by the use of motorboats. I have no personal opinion about that. A lot of people are mystified that you can't take a sailboat there, but you can take a motorboat. There are safety reasons and there are political reasons, and that's kind of the way it is, and probably won't be changing anytime soon. There's 9 towns in the North Quabbin region. I'll name them for you in alphabetical order. I'm usually pretty good at the 9 towns are Athol, Irving, New Salem, Orange, Petersham, Phillipston, Royalston, Warwick, and Wendell. So those are the 9 towns, and one of them, New Salem, actually has a large amount of its territory covered by water, and also offers this particular view. This is an overlook in the town of New Salem that was created only a few years ago. By coincidence, more or less, the chief Quabbin forester, a man named Bruce Spencer, helped to create this area by clearing some trees on the hillside. So you get a really beautiful view of the Quabbin. And I know a couple of my friends here in the room that have been there, and they can attest to what a wonderful view it is of the reservoir. There are other places you can hike in, and there's an excellent map of the Quabbin, which I do not have here. It's available from a company called New England Cartographics. So if you want to go hiking in the Quabbin along some of the old roads, there's great opportunities to do so. This is the Swift River East Branch in the town of Petersham. You see a man fly fishing there. And this is actually in the conserved land called the Swift River Reservation, which is a property of the trustees of reservations. This is a little bit of the middle branch of the Swift River. You can see it's just a little brook at that point. This is also in the town of New Salem, and this beautiful stone bridge is one of my favorite places. Quabbin access is through a series of numbered gates, and some of them are off limits because there are areas where trespassing is not allowed. But all through the northern section of the Quabbin, there's a lot of gates that are open. This happens to be gate number 30. The Quabbin has been the site of a very important activity by the state of Massachusetts in cooperation with Mass Audubon and the federal fish and wildlife people to restore bald eagle in our state. And these are a couple of young bald eagles right at the edge of the Quabbin. The bald eagle restoration is a great story. This picture was taken by Bill Byrne, who is our full-time state wildlife photographer, a wonderful guy. More water in our region. This is the Millers River, which is one of the 4 major tributaries of the Connecticut River, and it flows through the North Quabbin region through a section that geologists call the Massachusetts upland. Water is very important, I think, to people concerned about nature, whether you drink it, or look at it, or play in it, or just want it to be there to serve wildlife and make life possible. There's several beautiful waterfalls in our area. This one's called Royalston Falls, and this is in the town of Royalston. This is also a trustees of reservation property. Great hike to go in there and see this waterfall deep in the woods. It's a somewhat rigorous hike, and you get a wonderful reward. This is an old postcard showing Doan's Falls, which is also in Royalston and also a trustee's property. That old mill building is long gone. This postcard was published probably around 1910. The mill buildings are gone, and now it's a natural area with a beautiful stone bridge across it. And Jay Clark, the man who I just read about, was one of the people that built that stone bridge. He told me he was almost killed working on that. This is a train going through downtown Orange. Rail travel is important, not as important perhaps as it used to be, but this is a train bringing coal from the coal fields of the Midwest to a coal-burning power plant somewhere in eastern Massachusetts. One time I was hiking in an area in Athol called the Bears Den, and there's a view where you can look down on the river and also down on the railroad tracks. And when I was a kid, growing up in New York State, I used to love to watch the train go through and count cars. And so when I was on this rock one day, that's not where this picture was taken. This was taken in downtown Orange. But I was on this rock one day looking down at the railroad track, and a train was coming, and I counted the cars, and it was a train like this, filled with coal, 240 cars. Big source of energy for electricity in our state is coal. It's a leading source. Orange and Athol were long-time industrial communities. This is a kind of a typical little view of an industrial building. And you'll see on that chimney, MT Company. This building now has a kind of an incubator program for new industries. There's also a fitness gym in there. MT stands for Minute Tapioca, which used to be made in Orange, and then General Foods bought it. They shut down the factory in Orange and moved to Delaware. Lots of interesting architecture in the region. I'm just showing you a few of my favorites. One of the things that I really enjoy when people come to visit is to take them around and show them some of the interesting buildings. This is an old tavern that goes all the way back to the colonial era, and this is called the Ballard Tavern. It's in the town of Wendell. It's now a private home. This is from the federal period. This house is in Royalston, and it's been fixed up recently. They did a pretty nice job. I've been in this house. This is in the town of Petersham. There's a number of houses there in the bungalow style, most of them built in the 1800s. The town of Wendell is kind of a hippie-type town, and this is one of the odd structures that you see there, a lot of owner-built homes, the rainbow, love, and so on, solar panel. In the book, I kind of give a portrait of each of the 9 towns, and I talk about some of the unusual traits of Wendell as a town filled with a lot of socially conscious people. In 1973, when I moved to the area, Wendell only had about 400 people, so when 200 or 300 counterculture types moved in, it had a major impact on the town. This is a beautiful Victorian house in Athol, one of my favorites. Some wonderful stonework. This is just a retaining wall, and you see some stonemasons still being hired to do beautiful work in the area. We're very north central Massachusetts, near New Hampshire, the granite state, and there were granite quarries in our area too. None of them are active now, but you can see some of the results of these granite quarries. This is the public library in the town of Petersham, just celebrated its centennial a few years ago. This quaint roadside sign is quite old, and this is in the town of Warwick, which I mentioned before. That's where Mount Grace is. You can see the names of some of the towns there. You see on the top sign, you see Athol Depot, obviously a reference to when railroad travel by passengers was very important in our area. There haven't been any passenger trains since I think the early 60s. The Fitchburg line comes from North Station and ends at Fitchburg. For a short time, it continued out all the way to Gardner, but apparently they didn't have enough. But there's always talk about extending rail travel. There's a wonderful history trail in the town of Athol done by a local historian named Dick Jason, who's just a great guy, wonderful researcher, also a fellow journalist. He worked for the Worcester Telegram. And this is one of 24 signs that were erected around the time of the bicentennial. It tells a story about the town pound. Most of the area towns had a town pound where stray animals would be kept. There's some public art in our area, some nice fountains and statues. This is our most famous statue. This is the Peace statue in the town of Orange. It was installed in 1934. This is a close-up of it. You see a doughboy, a World War I soldier, talking to a young boy. And on the pedestal of the statue, it says, "It shall not be again." Unfortunately, that wasn't quite the way things worked out. It's a beautiful statue, and a few years back, it actually became the official peace statue of the state of Massachusetts. Definitely worth a look if you're out in the area. It's really quite moving to see this statue. Cemeteries are a source of great interest to me and other people that like history. And there's lots of cemeteries in our area with gravestones going back to the 1700s. And most of the local cemeteries have crypts like the one you see there behind the red brick. And the reason for that was they couldn't dig into the frozen soil in the winter months. So bodies were kept in the crypt and then put in the ground in the spring. Mostly now they can break through the soil with machinery, but some of the crypts are still actually used for this same purpose. This is in the Tully section of town of Orange. This is an interesting building in Petersham. It's called the Nichawag Inn, and then later it became the Montessori, the Maria Assumpta Academy, which was a Catholic school and also a home for retired nuns. The school closed some years ago, and they've had a lot of trouble finding a use for this building, and it's now property of the town. And the people of the town are trying to decide what to do with it. There's some brick buildings behind it that were used by the school. It's a beautiful old shingle-style building that was a country inn. If any of you have a few $1 million to invest, this could be a great project. Recreation in the area is important. This is in the town of Phillipston. This is called Queen Lake, and this is actually a public beach. There's a lot of private homes around this lake. It's one of the largest lakes in the area. One of the most interesting events in our region is called the River Rat Race, and it's quite a zany operation. They're having, I think, their 45th anniversary this year. And they usually get between 200 and 400 canoes going down the river in competition. It's a mixture of serious canoeists and then people that are just having a good time. Another fun thing along Route 2, this is in the town of Irving, is this set of scarecrows that a family puts up every year with a different theme. Just something that people did on their own just to entertain the people that drove by on Route 2, which is the main, of course, east-west highway in the northern part of the state. We have some agriculture in our area, not very much. This is a goat farm in Royalston. The woman on the right is Sherry. She's a nurse. I don't know if Jody makes enough money with the goats, and so it's a good thing that Sherry has a job as a nurse. Agriculture is not very easy in the state, but I think we have an increasing interest in locally grown food, so there's a lot of potential. This is a friend of mine, actually, and she and her husband own a sheep farm and all these border collies that help control the sheep. In the distance, you can see Mount Monadnock in southern New Hampshire. It's a beautiful sheep farm. They sell organic lamb as well as beef, and they love what they're doing. They moved to Royalston in 1973, around the same time that I did. There were a lot of young people, counterculture types, interested in homesteading. Very few really kept to the goal of having a farm, and this was one couple that really kept to their goal. This is some heifers in the Hunt Farm. It's the largest dairy farm in our region. The number of dairy farms has been declining throughout New England. I'm sure you're all aware of that. And companies like Walmart and other developers have been waiving large checks at George Hunt and his son George Hunt Jr. and people in the land protection business have been waiving small checks at them, hoping that they wouldn't sell their farm. And who knows what's going to happen. Right now, I know price of milk has just gone up a little, so that's helpful for the Hunts and for the protection of the land that they own, which they maintain a herd of about 100 cows, and they have many acres of corn and hay. And it'd be very sad to see this farm sold for development, but it's right on Route 2, and it's one of those things that we are concerned about, land protection. This is another old farm that has been protected. You see one cow in this picture. It's an old picture. Now there's a much more active farm that's taken over this land that's been protected with the help of the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust and also the state of Massachusetts program called the APR, Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program, which provides funds for farmers to protect their land, and then it must be reserved for agricultural use. And that hill in the background is the same Mount Grace that I've mentioned a couple of times. There's a number of nonprofit organizations in our vicinity. There's the Farm School in Athol. There's the Seeds of Solidarity Farm in Orange, Mount Grace Land Trust, which I've mentioned. And there's one in Petersham called Earthlinks. The man on the right is Larry Buell, who's the founder. And this is an environmental education organization. The building there is off the grid, and have many educational programs there and work on land protection as well. We also have culture in our region. Some years ago, the Boston Globe ran a series called Hidden Massachusetts. It was, maybe some of you remember it, and it focused on this region, central Massachusetts. Kind of gave you the impression that everybody there is either criminal or white trash. It was a pretty upsetting series of articles, and people in our region were really outraged by it. And I personally spoke to the Globe reporters, and they wouldn't listen, and we very rarely get any mention of our communities in the Boston Globe, unless it's something nasty. And one of the points that I tried to make in talking to the Boston Globe was about some of the wonderful community institutions we have, a small hospital, the Athol Memorial Hospital, and the 1794 Meeting House is a cultural center featuring performing artists throughout the summer and fall season. And this is one of the local artists. He's a very talented guitarist from the town of Wendell. That's the old church that was taken over by a nonprofit group. It's called the 1794 Meeting House, and seats about 150 people on old church pews, and it's really an opportunity to hear musicians, all different kinds of music, classical, popular, rock, folk, really just about anything. And this is the final slide, and I like this, chose this because it focuses on people. This is 3 generations. That's Esther Shepherdson and her daughter Nola and Nola's son Dak, and they're all working on in this garden, this beautiful garden. Right now you can see the lupin in this picture, and the older Mrs. Shepherdson started it, and the garden continues. It's a place where you can go and buy perennials, or you can just walk around and enjoy the garden. And I just think that they, to me, they kind of symbolize a positive energy and the natural beauty of the region. I'm going to just tell you a few facts about the Quabbin, and I'm going to read them from my book because that's a good way to make sure that they're correct. And the gentleman who introduced me did make a slight mistake. He said that 3 towns, the gentleman who introduced me did make a slight mistake. He said that 3 towns went out of existence. Actually, it was 4 towns, Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. And it is pronounced Greenwich because that's the way the people there used to say it. And that happened in the 1930s, and there were about 2,500 people that were removed from their homes. In addition to that, they dug up the graves of several thousand people. I'm going to get to that here. Okay, the first thing that happened was in 1927, the legislature passed the Swift River Act, which called for the construction of the reservoir in the Swift River Valley and an aqueduct to connect it to the existing system, which was the Wachusett Reservoir, and before that, Lake Cochituate, which that's a hard one to say, but I got close anyway. And they came up with $65 million to fund the project. And the state of Connecticut, fearful of a dramatic reduction in the amount of water flowing into the Connecticut River, went to court. However, in 1931, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Massachusetts was within its rights. Connecticut did garner agreement that requires Massachusetts to maintain the flow of the Swift River out of the reservoir at a rate of 20 million gallons daily. In 1932, the reservoir officially was given a name, Quabbin, a Nipmuc Indian word for the place or meeting of many waters. By this time, the exodus of the valley had already begun. Properties were purchased, trees were cut, buildings dismantled, burned, or moved. It's a myth, by the way, that there's churches under there with the bells ringing. There's nothing under there. Everything was cut down and carted away, except maybe some stone walls and abandoned roads. 242 miles of roads were abandoned, 36 miles of state highway were relocated, 16 miles of railroad, most of it the fabled Rabbit Run, and there's some books written about that, were abandoned. I already mentioned 2,500 persons living in 650 houses were compelled to find new homes. A detailed survey available through the Mass Historical Commission. A total of 7,561 human remains previously buried in 34 cemeteries in the valley was relocated. Of these, 6,601 went to the newly created 82-acre Quabbin Park Cemetery in Ware. which is maintained by the Massachusetts Water Authority. Well, it keeps changing its name, whatever it is now. And at the MDC headquarters in Belchertown, records of the old towns are maintained. And here's a little tidbit: the Quabbin superintendent continues to serve as town clerk for the 4 eradicated towns. So if you were born in Enfield and you need a birth certificate, that's when you go to Belchertown. There's a lot of facts in here about the reservoir, but I'm going to read the ones that I think are most interesting as far as the reservoir itself. The reservoir is 18 miles long, depth 151 feet maximum and 45 feet average. Shoreline length, excluding islands, 118 miles. Length of shoreline of islands, 63 miles. Reservoir capacity, 412 billion gallons. And this is my favorite statistic because I can't imagine how they figured this out. Top inch when full, 750 million gallons. Average daily withdrawal from reservoir by users, 250 million gallons. Reservoir surface area, 25,000 acres. Watershed area, 81,000 acres. Towns in watershed. Now listen to the names of these towns: Athol, Barry, Belchertown, Hardwick, New Salem, Orange, Pelham, Petersham, Phillipston, Shutesbury, Ware, and Wendell. Highest watershed elevation, Prospect Hill in Phillipston, 1,383 feet above sea level. Prospect Hill in Phillipston, by the way, is located right near the Harvard Forest, a great place to visit. And if you want to go there, you climb up a tower, and there's a really nice view. One of the things that I've said at some of the meetings of the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust is we have to talk to the people who live in Boston and in the suburbs. Now, I've lived in cities, and I've lived in suburbs, and I've lived in rural areas. I grew up on a chicken farm in the Catskills. And I think that each of these types of communities have their pluses and their minuses. I think we know that. And I think that the people who live in a suburban community like Newton, you're doing wonderful work here to protect some open space in your town. But whatever you protect in Newton, it's still a suburban community. Boston is still an urban community. Our region is a rural community, gravely endangered toward becoming suburban. A lot of the towns in let's say the 495 area have gone from being country towns to being suburban towns. And I think it's very important for all of the citizens of the Commonwealth to help protect the rural sections of Massachusetts, which are mostly in the central and western part of the state.